Hello, 6th grade. This is Mrs. Froman, and you're going to take notes on Chapter 3, Section 3 from Environmental Science, and it's on biodiversity. Remember, the prefix bio means life, so diversity is the differences, so biodiversity is the number of different species in a certain area. Now, there's some factors that affect biodiversity, like how much biodiversity there can be in an area. One of those is area, so the bigger the area, the more species that can live there. Another is climate, so the number of species increase from the poles to the equator. So that means when you start at like the North and South Pole, there's not a whole lot of different species that live there, but by the time you get to the equator, that's the biggest diversity of animals that we see. For instance, rainforests cover only 7% of the earth, but they're home to over half the world's species. So even in that small area, there's a lot of different species that live there together. Another factor is niche diversity. So the more niches that there are available, the greater variety of species living there. Remember, a niche is where an animal lives, like its kind of job in the ecosystem. So the more niches that are available, the more species can live there because they can do all kinds of different things in that environment. For instance, coral reefs are home to 20% of the saltwater fish, but they only make up 1% of the ocean. So there's an example of niche diversity. There's lots of different niches in the coral reef, and that's what makes it such a great place for lots of different species of ocean organisms to live. So why do we care about biodiversity? What's the big deal? Well, one is economic value, so money. Many plants and animals provide oxygen, that's really important, medicines, materials for clothing, and then ecotourism provides jobs. So ecotourism is like if you go down to South America and tour a rainforest. There's guides and hotels and everything you'd use there. So that's one way. Another reason is the value to the ecosystem. So all species in an ecosystem are connected. There's something called a keystone species, and that's one species that influences the survival of many other species. So they're very important to that ecosystem. One example is sea stars, or starfish as you might call them. They prey on mussels, they eat mussels, but when they disappear from that ecosystem, the mussels overpopulate and other species die because the mussels are taking up all the room and all the food. Gene pool diversity is also important. So genes carry the hereditary information and determine your characteristics, size, and appearance of organisms. The gene pool is the total individual differences of a species. So if you look at human beings, like the picture down here, there's a lot of differences in that gene pool. There's lots of different hair types, skin colors, eye colors, heights, shapes, sizes, all that kind of stuff. So lots of diversity in the gene pool of humans. So species with a diverse gene pool are better able to adapt and survive. Remember when we talked about natural selection earlier in the year, if you have a lab we did with the birds and the beaks, they had lots of different beaks, they had diversity of their beaks. So when a change came along, the species was still able to survive even though some of them died, and that's where the gene pool comes in. If you have a lot of differences in your gene pool, you're better able to adapt to changes. Extinction is the disappearance of all members of a species from the earth. It's happened during humans' lifetime. We've been responsible for a lot of extinction of animals. And you may have heard of the endangered species list. An endangered species is a species that's in danger of becoming extinct in the near future. That means their numbers are very low and they may not survive. A threatened species is a species that could become endangered in the future. So this is where all that watching animal populations come in. So keeping count of certain animals so we know when they reach that point so we can start doing things to make sure they don't become endangered or extinct. Some causes of extinction, sometimes natural events like earthquakes and volcanoes, but the biggest one is really habitat destruction. That's the major cause of extinction, and that's mainly because of humans. There's something called habitat fragmentation, and this means we're breaking the habitat into small isolated pieces. Like we have nature preserves and parks and stuff in little pieces here and there around neighborhoods, but they're not very connected. So this makes species more vulnerable. For one thing, they can get hit by cars trying to go from one place to another. It also makes their population smaller, so if they get sick, it could devastate the population more so if you had a big population. Plants may have trouble dispersing their seeds because it's hitting pavement and stuff. And then some animals need lots of room to live. I mean, things like mountain lions, they have something like a 50-mile radius or something like that. They need a lot of room. Poaching is another cause of endangered and threatened species. Poaching is the illegal killing and or removal of animals. And this is a picture of, it's kind of hard to tell, but this was a elephant. And the poachers, what they do is they just kill the elephant, basically cut the front half off so they can easily get their tusks out of there. And then they just take the tusks and leave the elephant there just to rot. And then also pollution can kill or weaken animals and cause birth defects. So that's another big problem, especially with ocean organisms. Then exotic species is another threat, and that's introducing species that are not native to the ecosystem, which then multiply quickly without predators and can endanger native species. So this picture here it says, please stop and remove all aquatic plants and drain water from your boat and trailer. And this is a sign of exotic species that they're looking out for. So they're having people do that to keep exotic species from coming, because if you take your boat from one place to another, you may inadvertently be bringing those species on your boat. And then, of course, this says pythons. A lot in the Florida Everglades, there's a lot of pythons. It's a huge problem there now because so many people buy like ball pythons and these different big snakes at the pet stores when they're all little and cute. They don't realize they get 10 to 20 feet long, and then they just let them go in the Everglades, and they're destroying the habitat by eating everything in sight, and not to mention people's pets and endangering a lot of animals there. Protecting biodiversity. So some of the things that we do to help biodiversity, one of them is captive breeding, and that's we're breeding endangered species in captivity and releasing them back into the wild. And there's one not too far from us, just north of Wisconsin, called Operation Migration, and they captive breed whooping cranes, and then they teach them how to fly the migration route down to Florida, and they do that every year. And then there's some laws and treaties, and things like the Endangered Species Act. This outlaws importing or trading of items made from endangered or threatened species. So like being able to use that elephant ivory is really against the law, but people still do it and they sell it on the black market. And then there was a Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. That was a treaty with 80 nations that lists 700 species that can't be traded for profit. So these are some laws that they've tried to put in effect to keep animals from becoming endangered. And one of the other things we do is habitat preservation. So that's where we're protecting a whole ecosystem. And the United States was the first one to have an actual park where we set aside just for wildlife, and that was in 1872. Yellowstone National Park became the world's first national park. And today there are about 7,000 nature parks worldwide. So the whole world has started making parks for wild and setting that aside for wildlife. So, all right, that's it for these notes. So don't forget to do your quack, and we'll see you in class.